Hello everyone. First I would like to thank you for checking out Gamersliced and the first review on the channel. This is supposed to be the fourth review on the channel at least, but this is the first review. Tom Clancy's The Division. Now Tom Clancy's The Division is one of the most highly anticipated games of all time, and it has finally been released. It is actually Ubisoft's fastest selling IP, and there was so much hinging on this game. But in the end, it doesn't really deliver in full what it set out to. The hype for this game has been built up for nearly 3 years now, and many people, including myself, nearly forgot about the game's existence several times. That was Ubisoft's first mistake. For one, they announced it too early because of two things. One, people might forget about it, and two, the graphics downgrade, which is pretty apparent, and everybody always is on top of those. It's pretty much expected at this point that a Ubisoft game is going to get a graphics downgrade. And based off of what Ubisoft has shown off at E3s and numerous other gaming conventions, The Division is lacking features that were previously shown off, or they have been severely changed. Now most players, I would estimate, would probably spend between 25 and 35 hours in The Division, unless they are really playing the Dark Zone a lot. Me personally, it took me about 45 hours when I beat the game, and in total I have spent a little over 50 hours in it. And from that 50 hours, I can tell you that The Division is a very mixed bag. Now let me tell you why. The Division seems to be focused much more on its gameplay than any of the other elements of the game. The gameplay mechanics, for one, are quite good, and most of the cover mechanics and shooting mechanics are smooth, but some of the animations can be a bit sticky, like when you're dropping down from a car. The guns behave very much like you would expect them to, which is not a bad thing. And they're very responsive. The variety of weapons is also quite impressive. You have everything from your assault rifles to your shotguns to marksman rifles, which can be quite effective early on or for non-elite enemies. Then LMGs, SMGs, and you also have your sidearm slot, where you can use a pistol or even a sawed-off shotgun that you might get later on down the line. As you would expect from an RPG, these weapons are highly customizable. But although it can be very generic, it can change the way a weapon performs by a fairly significant margin. Now, The Division is one of those RPGs that you would call a looter shooter. You simply shoot enemies to acquire loot, and that's the basic gameplay loop. And if you like that type of a game, you're going to love it here. But you can do more than just loot the weapons and attachments. You can also receive them as mission awards or crafting blueprints, which the crafting system could have been fleshed out a little bit better, because most of the time you get these blueprints, and by the time you have the required components to craft them, or by the time you get the blueprint, you already are carrying just as good, if not better, weapons with you. So probably about 90% of the crafting blueprints go unused, which is a real misstep, given there are so many opportunities to collect crafting components in this world. And of course, if you want the best weapons and the weapons most suited for your level, you go into the Dark Zone to extract the contaminated items from there, which is where all the PvP aspects come into play. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. You will also loot a lot of cosmetic items, which there is a lot of, and are really nice to be able to customize your character. Now, The Division is branded as an MMORPG. The MMO aspect is only half the game, just the Dark Zone aspect. The rest of the game, there's no MMO to it, but there is up to 4-player co-op. Now, since The Division is an RPG, no matter how you cut it, there is going to be a lot of weapons, stats, damage numbers, and of course the ability to score critical hits on enemies. And last but not least, the biggest thing that makes RPGs what they are, or pseudo-RPGs, are skills. The skills and perk system in this game is easily one of the best elements. And you don't use your level XP to purchase the skills, you use research points. The JTF sets up a base of operations in New York, right next to Madison Square Garden. And in that base of operations there are 3 wings. The medical wing, which is dedicated to stopping the virus unleashed on the city. The tech wing, which is focused on getting the city up and running again. And the security wing, which is focused on ridding the city of the scum that has inhabited it during this crisis. To get these research points, in order to upgrade your character's skills, you will be doing a combination of main missions and encounters, which are the encounters are side activities which are often quite repetitive, involving camping around, defending some supplies from waves of enemies, or possibly going and activating these boot up these little scanner things to be able to research a cure for the virus, or helping the JTF assault an enemy stronghold just to lessen the enemy's control in that region. But that has no actual effect on how often they appear in the region for the most part, except around that very tiny area. But to get the most research points, you'll want to be doing the missions associated with that wing of the base of operations. The upgrades cost different amounts of points. There are 3 types of upgrades. There are both active and passive. First, there's the skills and the mods that go along with them. There's the talents, which are more like stat buffs and offer you like unique perks and little tiny passive abilities for your character. And lastly, there are perks, which are much more passive. And some of them unlock unique workstations in the base of operations. One such being the recalibration station, which allows you to change one stat on any one of your items, not including weapons. Which I found myself using quite frequently, as it was very handy in order to boost a stat so I could unlock the perk associated with a particular weapon. In the end, though, while these upgrades are really cool and very helpful when you're venturing out on your own, it's not really necessary to synergize your abilities with your team while doing missions due to the nature of the game, since you're just pumping bullets into enemies a lot of times. But it does provide a sense of teamwork, and it will make the missions a bit easier and flow more smoothly. There is one very glaring issue with the game, though, that the majority of people are talking about, and it's actually quite a subjective criticism. This is the fact that many of the enemies in the game are bullet sponges. Now, initially, I didn't have a problem with this until I went into the Dark Zone, and when I started doing the main missions on hard difficulty, some of them became increasingly hard because the AI would just walk towards you while you're pumping bullets into them, and they're shooting back at you with pinpoint accuracy, and they don't give a shit, and then you get taken out. So it's really necessary, especially if you're doing missions on hard difficulty, to have a team with you. Preferably a full 4-player group. And most people are having a problem with this, including myself to some extent by the end, because the game tries to put itself in a realistic setting, but then, I mean, of course it is an RPG, so it's not going to achieve that fully because of the nature of RPGs in general. But this aspect of the game really breaks most people's immersion, where a guy with a hoodie can take multiple shots to the head from an assault rifle. If you have a marksman rifle early on, you can one-shot them, but if they're an elite enemy, you're definitely not going to be able to do that. What really throws you off, though, is when you get to an elite enemy and they have so much more health, and you can pump like 20 bullets into their head, and you just barely take care of their armor. Honestly, the Division's theme really hinders it in the genre it's in, and there is a lot of possibilities that they have basically cut off of themselves. But for someone like myself, I was able to get past most of those and get a fair amount of enjoyment out of the game. In the end, though, Massive wanted to make a game with this theme that was in this genre, in the RPG genre. So sacrifices would have to be made, and that's something you really can't get around. So if bullet spongy enemies in a real life scenario are something you can't get past, then I would say this game is probably not for you, as this is one of the biggest drawbacks to the game for a lot of players. Secondly, the other issue that I found with the gameplay that not many other people are talking about is the hit detection. It's a bit delayed. It's even been worsened since the patch 1.02, where sometimes you'll actually pump a whole clip into an enemy they won't do any damage, and then about 5 seconds later it'll all kick in and then they'll go down. But generally speaking, it may only be about a second delay at most. But it's really annoying, and this is likely due to the always online connection. Even if you're not playing with other players, it's still always connected online. The game, when it initially launched, didn't really have too many other tech problems either. But after the patch, some other ones seemed to come up. One of them being that I even experienced this firsthand. Me and some other people were trying to get the mission to start, and the mission wouldn't start.
If you set the mission, I should say as the group mission, will it start? Are we having issues getting it to start right now?
I can't get it to start either. But it worked earlier with the other missions, and I really don't know why it's not working.
Yeah, try selecting it on the map. Or it looks like you already did.
I had this yesterday with where I joined another random group, and they had the same problem. But let's just reselect it.
Try making somebody else the group leader, maybe?
Yeah, so let's try that.
Well, it just gave me a pop-up to teleport to the mission.
Yeah, I did that too, just in case maybe it reloads the map. No, I guess just disband the group, or maybe quit the application and come back in. It's the only thing that helped yesterday. Bye!
So hopefully Ubisoft or Massive will get these problems ironed out pretty quickly, as it seems to be just something from the most recent patch. So hopefully they'll get a new patch out pretty soon, and also get the graphics options that were promised for console players to be able to like up your frame rate. Because I've made a video earlier about this, but these options are still not in the game. They weren't in the game as of release, and they're not in the game as of when I'm doing this review. One last thing to comment on about the gameplay, or more specifically the AI, is that the enemies like to rush you and flank you, even if they're not a guy with a baseball bat or a shotgun, which you'll encounter a little bit later on in the game. If you are alone, you are going to get flanked a lot, especially if you're in a mission where there's a more confined area. So now let's talk about the graphics and the level design. On a positive note, the game's going to look pretty good while you're doing all this, as the graphics in this game are actually quite impressive despite the downgrade. Yes, it's not the graphical masterpiece that it was looking to be when they showed it previous years at E3, but it is still a pretty damn impressive looking game. And on the PC, I've heard it's one of the best. All the effects are actually quite impressive too on the console, especially when you shoot a cleaner and their tank explodes. When you get into parts of the world where there's snow, it looks quite beautiful, especially with a lot of the lighting effects that this game utilizes. But on the console, it really only hits those impressive graphics marks in a couple places. So being able to possibly turn off some of these lighting effects in order to get a better frame rate would be nice. But as I said, Ubisoft has still not put those options in there. Being an open world game, you're probably going to be spending a lot of time in that world, so you're going to want the city to be beautiful. One off-putting thing with the level design, though, regardless of whether you're in mission areas or with the open world, is you'll quite often run into invisible walls. Sometimes they'll be major. Or sometimes they'll be more minor, like a piece of cover that you just for some reason can't vault over. Now, one of my early concerns with the open world portion of it was that the game would be just a running simulator. And in the first couple of areas it is, because the enemy sparsity is not, you know, all that high. But as you get further into the game, once you get you know, maybe to like the 5th district or so, the enemy density is bumped up a notch, and the world starts feeling more alive in an odd way. There are also some other snippets that make the world seem more believable. For instance, there are civilians that you can aid by giving them some of your supplies, such as canned food or a bottle of water. And a good portion of these civilians are actually foreigners, probably illegal immigrants, which makes sense that these would be some of the people that would be left in the city because they wouldn't have the ability to, you know, leave and get safe transit.
Ya no se ve mucha bondad, gracias.
Спасибо тебе огромное.
Also, one of the other strong points of the game that adds to the believability of the world and of the scenarios going on are many of the side missions. About half of the side missions are actually quite interesting, especially the ones where you activate echo beacons around the city to trigger a recreation of the events that happen, much like the detective mode introduced in some of the Batman games. A good deal of the story actually plays out in some of these little scenarios as well, and it really makes you feel like you're uncovering this mystery and figuring out what happens to these other Division agents or whatnot.
Get back here, Doug! We're getting killed over here!
On my way. Move till I get there.
They picked us clean. And didn't even have the decency to put a bullet in my head. Said it was a waste of ammo.
I'll make them pay for this. They're all gonna die.
They're headed north towards 41st. Talking about some kind of safe house. Go get him, Doug. Oh.
But you never really encounter any of these people throughout the world unless you're maybe tracking someone down in order to save them. Then you save them and that's it. But for all these things that make the world more believable and feel more real, there's all these encounters which, although realistic, kind of devalue your experience with the game as they are very repetitive. There's also a huge number of collectibles in this game, which for the most part they're unnecessary, but you can get little snippets of some people's backstories of how they're handling the disaster and what happened. So there's a bit of story elements in those collectibles as well. But for the most part, there's just way too many of them, and there's no real incentive to go out and get them. Now we come to the main missions, which are the bulk of the game, unless you spend a ton of time in the Dark Zone. But to properly talk about the main missions, or the meat of the game, we need to discuss the story, which is the big question about this game. What happened? Is the story good enough? Should I buy this game for this story? Well, as you could probably tell, I'm gonna say no, probably don't buy it for the story. Although the story is interesting, it doesn't go very deep. Now, a lot of people have made comparisons between Destiny and The Division even before the game released, and it's fair to do so. There are many areas where you can compare these two games, mainly in just their idea of what type of game they're planning on being. But one aspect in particular is the story. Destiny is known for not having much of a story, and disclaimer here, I've only played a real small portion of Destiny, so I don't know how the whole story plays out and how much there is of it. But from what I can tell, the story seems a bit more substantial in The Division. But it is definitely not as interesting, mainly because it's too grounded in reality, whereas Destiny has more opportunities because it's fictional and sci-fi. Tom Clancy's name is slapped onto The Division, and honestly the only deserving portion of the game, of his name, is the story, other than maybe I guess kind of the tactics elements of the gameplay. But this is by far not the best Tom Clancy story. So the premise of the story, probably not any spoilers, it's Black Friday happens, and on Black Friday a super virus is released, which is transmitted because of all the hustle and bustle and commerce and transferred on the bills. The virus is a mutated version of smallpox with a couple other viruses mixed in there to give it that extra kick. Leading up to the game's launch, a lot of people were wondering and asking developers in interviews, How far is this virus spread? Is it around the rest of the United States? Is it around the world? Or is it just confined to New York? Well, it seems that it's just confined to New York, but the game really never answers that question. But honestly, near the end of the story, which I can't go into detail as it would spoil the game, it seems as though the virus would have been released in a lot of other places as well. But the game never tells you for certain. So in the wake of this bioterrorist attack on the nation, the Division is activated, which is a group of ordinary people, more like pretty much sleeper agents living amongst the populace, just normal people that are activated along with the Joint Task Force to restore the city and help people out and try to find the cure to the virus. Pretty much the Division is just acting as judge, jury, and executioner most of the time, just killing everybody in sight that has a gun. And while you sometimes are doing field work to research the virus and find a cure to make the vaccine, most of the time the Division is just doing the dirty work around the city. Their primary objective is to shut down the leaders of the factions, of which there are 3. And I gotta say, the motivation for each of the factions, while fairly similar, are quite interesting and have some unique spins. All of them basically think that conventional efforts of dealing with this virus are not going to work in this scenario, and they think they need to kill the people infected with the virus. But the Rikers are more kind of like a gang. They roam the streets. They're criminals, more or less. I believe led by an ex-con. The Cleaners, on the other hand, believe they need to burn the virus. They can't just kill people and whatever. They need to burn it.
This is not rocket science. You don't need a degree from some fancy college to understand exactly what's going on here. This virus is going to continue to spread as long as there are infected people walking around. Now, you can put up all the fences and checkpoints you want, but that's not going to stop a virus. You want to kill it? You have to burn it. Destroy it completely and before it can spread.
In the Last Man Battalion, which you encounter towards the end, is led by Colonel Bliss. From what I can tell, they're basically another military force, kind of like the JTF, only they're taking a much more aggressive approach to stopping the virus. So from here, the story is told during and between each of the main missions. Story actually plays into the level design a lot, and factions are where you would expect them to be. The Cleaners are sometimes underground. They're in highly contaminated areas. The Rikers are in places where they might find weapons within like police stations and whatnot. And the LMB, they're like downtown. They're like around the UN building. They're in pretty big groups, highly armed. Main missions are easily one of the best parts of the game, and when you complete a mission, you'll get this piece of evidence, oftentimes video footage, and some of them are quite interesting. But in the end, they don't amount to too much. It would have been nice to see them fleshed out more. They really only fill in little missing bits of the story. Now, in playing through these main story missions, a lot of the engagements are actually set up quite well. There are a lot of places where you can get to higher cover and flank the enemy and whatnot. And a lot of them are wave defense kind of, and one of the issues, though, this is more of an issue in the Dark Zone, but there are places in the level where sometimes there'll be a couple waves of enemies and they'll spawn out of, and it's not really clear where they're going to spawn from, so you'll get right in the spawn zone and then they'll pop up right in front of you. Story missions can create some really awesome moments, especially when playing on hard difficulty and your team gets through it just by the skin of their teeth, which has happened numerous times. But hard difficulty is a bit insane. And it's not very clear because sometimes, for instance, I went into a mission saying it was level 16 mission. Then I went to play on hard expecting, yes, it's going to give me level 16 enemies, but it's going to make them elite enemies. Well, it turns out that's not the case. It actually put them, I was level 24 at the time, and it put them to level 24, and we got killed immediately on the first group of enemies. Now, despite these main story missions being one of the best parts of it, they're often hit and miss. A lot of them are fairly similar, but the key missions have some, which there's about 7 or 8 of them, have some pretty good set piece moments and are quite entertaining. Finally, when it comes to the main story, one of the most satisfying portions is the last 3 missions of the game, the last 2 of which tie together very smoothly. The final boss in particular was quite easily the best boss in the game, as rather than just pumping bullets into him, which you could do that, there was actually an arena in which you had to use different weapons and like some turrets or whatever to take the boss down. However, at least one of the guys I was playing with and I could not figure out how to activate these turrets or how to do the other stuff, so for the most part we were just taking out the ground units, kind of swarming us at the same time, and occasionally shooting at the boss. But after the fight ends, you get a little message over your intercom, and that's basically the end of the game. There's a small side mission afterwards which kind of wraps it up, but it was lacking, to say the least. It left me feeling like nothing I did really mattered. Yes, I came close to finding a cure, but the city was never actually restored, and like the enemies never really leave. Despite their leaders being taken out, they're still roaming the streets. And by the end of it, some of the key players responsible for this virus, I didn't really understand how they fit into the big picture. The role was pretty clear, but the events leading up to that point were not very well explained. Now that's the PvE portion of the game. Now we come to the PvP portion of the game, the Dark Zone. I played both of the betas for The Division, and I spent most of my time in the Dark Zone as that was the main thing to do in the beta. There wasn't much in the way of single player content, other than a couple hours. But I'll be entirely honest with you, I got more enjoyment out of the Dark Zone in the beta than I did in the main game. I went to the Dark Zone once when I was around like level 11 or 12, and then I went into it again after I basically finished the game. Players need to get into the Dark Zone at pretty much the minimum level required, because when you hit level 30, the Dark Zone is hard as all balls. And initially you can only take several bullets before going down. Ever since I started talking about this game, I always said you need to travel the Dark Zone with a friend, but here it's even more so. Like, you could lone wolf it and it would be quite challenging, but now it's almost impossible if you get in at level 30, at least until you get a few more weapons out of the Dark Zone. Because with the level cap being 30, the level 30 weapons that you get from the main portion of the game, when you take them in the Dark Zone, they're just not good enough, so you need Dark Zone level 30 items to really even compete in the Dark Zone. You really need to go in early, because if you wait to beat the game before you get the items in the Dark Zone, you're really only getting those items to either replay missions or to use them in the Dark Zone to kill enemies to get even better weapons. And it's just this endless loop. So really the Dark Zone is a lot less meaningful, and it's quite pointless unless you really enjoy that core gameplay loop of killing enemies to get more loot. Which I did in the beta, but it got old. I think I overplayed it, but it just didn't seem as enjoyable in the full version. And finally, one of the biggest problems with the Dark Zone, which was occurrent in the beta, and it still is the spawns on the extraction zones. So many of them are so bad. I counted, like, there was countless times I would be trying to clear out enemies to extract my items, and before I could clear out the enemies that were there in the beginning, new enemies had already respawned. And it sometimes took me nearly an hour to get some items extracted, and a couple times I just gave up because it wasn't worth it. Not only would they just spawn like that, I'd come in there, I'd get my items, I'd get ready to extract, and they'd literally spawn like a couple feet away from me, shoot me once or twice, and I was down. I couldn't do it. Now, this problem is really caused by just doing it alone, but even with another person, it can sometimes be quite challenging. And really, I would say this entire game, no matter how you cut it, Dark Zone or not, it's to get the full experience, you need to be playing with a friend. Dark Zone really feels quite lacking. There's not much to do. People even don't go rogue that much, it seems, by the time you get to level 30, because it's just too hard and nobody wants to risk it. But with all this being said, the Division is an incredibly mixed bag. I enjoyed most of my experience with it, but I don't feel I got the full experience because I didn't play with friends. Outside of the main missions and maybe the side missions and maybe a couple of encounters, it felt quite lacking, and I wanted more from it. I felt like a good portion of my time in the open world was wasted doing these encounters that were quite repetitive, and I really didn't want to do them. Now, before I give my final score, there's something we absolutely must talk about. The Seasons Pass. I said that overall, at the end of my experience, I left wanting more. The Seasons Pass is going to give you more, but for $40 freaking dollars. And if you've if you looked into what the Seasons Pass has to offer, as I have, this is stuff that should have been in the game to begin with. There's like these special like raid missions where you can do co-op. There's even some stuff that like, it does this in the Dark Zone, so it gives more meaning to the Dark Zone. Also, there's these Phoenix credits, which you can unlock by doing the daily missions, because every day there's like 2 missions they select. And you can apparently spend them at the shop back in the base of operations, but I don't really see what the point in doing them is. But it sounds like they're going to come into play more with the Seasons Pass. So at the end, this game is really not a $60 game, but the Seasons Pass could change that. So I would say as the game is right now, it's maybe $30. But I would wait till it goes down to about $20, and then maybe pick up the Seasons Pass along with it or something like that, and then you'll probably have a more complete experience. One of the most annoying things about this, though, is right after you beat the game, it gives you this message and tries to shove the frickin' Seasons Pass right down your throat. Just directs you straight to the store page. At this point, it became abundantly clear that in order to get the full experience, you would have to shell out an additional $40 for the Seasons Pass on top of the already $60 asking price, bringing the game to a total of $100. Absolutely unacceptable for this type of game. This Seasons Pass crap needs to stop. If you want to release DLC later on, that's fine. Go ahead. But make it worth my while to buy it. Give me stuff that doesn't feel like it's torn straight out of the main game. They're losing consumers' trust in the product. Nowadays, I don't know if when I go and buy a game for $60, I don't know if I'm going to get a complete game or not. I don't know. It's just totally up in the air. Which is why, for the most part, like I've pretty much stopped buying Ubisoft games. The only reason I bought this game day one to begin with was because it was like one of my most anticipated games for a long time, and it slowly, as it kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed, I lost interest in it. And this is a real big game. I want to see what it has to offer. It seems very controversial, so I wanted to pick it up. And now my final score for Tom Clancy's Division. Took me a little bit of effort to arrive at this score. But my final score is a 6 out of 10. It just gets by, just barely gets by, almost was a 5, but I decided to give it a 6 because I kept coming back to it, even a couple times after I finished the game. And even during the beta, like there wasn't much to do, but I kept coming back to it, mainly because the Dark Zone seemed more fun back then. But if I had not enjoyed the combat and getting the loot as much, this easily could have been a 5. And I think the length has a great deal to do with the tolerability of the game. If the game was any longer, if it was like maybe even 60, 70 hours, I think the score for this game would have went down. I would have not liked it that much. And I can tell you, if this game was close to 100 hours, I would probably just... I don't know, it could have been maybe the first game that I didn't actually play through in its entirety, and I paid $60 for. So that's my review of The Division, first review on the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. I would like to know what you guys thought of the game if you played it, or tell me what you thought of my review. Was it helpful? Just give me as much feedback as you can. I would really love that. Probably should have said this at the beginning of the video, since a lot of you may not have stuck around to the end. And also be sure to check out our channel for any other content that you might like. We do a lot of things here. We do Let's Plays. I do first impressions. We do collaboration stuff. We do montages. Lots of great stuff. So be sure to check that out. If you like what we do, please subscribe and be sure to thumbs up any videos that you liked. So thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, see you guys in the next video.